Welcome back. We're looking at the process by which Americans went from being very loyal British subjects, loving their king more than anybody else, as of 1763 when the 7 Years' War ended, and yet 13 years later in 1776 they're going to be declaring their independence. And we're figuring how that process took place, how Americans got transformed from being loyal British subjects to wanting their independence. And we saw that the starting point of that was the British policy of dealing with land in the West that they acquired from France as a result of winning, if you will, the 7 Years' War. Their reward was getting all of that land west of the Appalachian Mountains. So they've got to deal with that. And we saw that the first step was to put it off limits to British settlement and reserve it for Indians. Well, that did not have much of an impact in America because so few people wanted to go west of the Appalachians. But some people did, and they were very bitter that they were not able to follow through on the plans that they had made for use of that land. More serious issue was taxes. We went through last week, we went through a whole bunch of the ups and downs of taxes, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend duties. But by 1770, England had finally decided just give up on trying to tax the Americans. So in 1770, they repealed the Townshend duties, and for all intents and purposes, they stopped trying to get revenue out of the Americans. They had decided it just wasn't worth it. It was more trouble than it was worth. For the amount of money they got, it was costing them a lot more to try to enforce the law. They had more soldiers in Boston than they had on the western frontier. I mean, the whole idea of doing this was to have soldiers out there to keep an eye on the Indians, and the Indians haven't been a problem. The British had been very worried in 1763 when Pontiac led his rebellion, but there's been none others. They haven't had any problems with the Indians, but they've had lots of problems with Americans in Boston and other American cities. So what's the point? You know, the British are not the smartest people in the world, but they finally figured out, wait a minute, this is not working, it's not worth it. So they've given up on the idea of taxing the Americans. They just don't need the revenue, it's too hard to get it, so they just forget about it. But they don't want to give up the idea that Parliament is supreme. They don't want to give up the idea that Parliament can tax. So they leave one of the Townshend duties in effect, the one on tea. They left that in effect, but it's only symbolic. Americans don't import tea from England, from the East India Company. So there's no revenue involved. It's not any money. It's the principle. It's Parliament saying, we still have the right to tax you if we want. But as long as it's not any money, the Americans are willing to overlook it. So the violence stops, the mobs go home, the tarring and feathering ends, and there's a calm restored to American cities and to the American countryside. But there's still that idea that Parliament has the right to tax. They haven't given that up. And there's also the fact that there's still resentment over the fact that Americans can't settle to the West. And there are people who had dreams of setting up land companies and gaining that land in the West from friendly assemblies, and now they can't. So there are things that are different, things that are still causing problems. So it's not, although there's no violence and there's no rioting, it's not quite the same as total peace as it had been before any of this whole stuff started back in 1763. And there's another issue that is going to cause problems, and it's not being very active, but it's a very serious problem that's going to cause dissension between Americans and English administrators and Parliament. You remember that England has had on the books since 1733 the Molasses Act, which attempted to tax foreign sugar brought into the North American colonies. But it really wasn't a tax. It was artificially set so high that there's no possible way anybody could afford to pay the tax. The purpose of it was to prevent Americans from importing tea from the non-British West Indies. And the two biggest examples of that would have been Cuba, a French colony, Cuba, a Spanish colony, and Haiti, a French colony. But other colonies throughout the Caribbean, other smaller islands, were also not allowed to import sugar to North America. But as we said, even when we were still meeting in person, that law was never enforced. The people who were responsible for enforcing it were the governors. The governors knew well enough that if they tried to enforce the law, they could. They've got absolute power. But if they actually tried to do it, that first of all, they just have trouble with the assemblies, and that means all sorts of problems for them, including that they won't get their salaries. So they don't want to antagonize the assemblies. And the other thing is, they're not getting any convictions, because as British subjects, Americans have right to trial by jury. And everybody sort of knows that a jury composed of the friends and relatives and neighbors and business associates of the smugglers is not going to convict them. So most governors take the idea, along with everything else that they just sort of go along with, they say, we're just not going to enforce that law. So it had not been enforced. But then, of course, during the 7 Years' War, France and Spain were enemies of Great Britain. We're fighting a war against them. So what did Americans do about importing sugar from the Spanish and French West Indies? Well, they kept on smuggling. I mean, they're loyal British subjects. They love their king. They're very patriotic. They're very proud of being the English. They're part of the English Empire. They think of themselves as British subjects. But hey, this is business. We're talking here about money. So the smuggling went on just as normal, even though we're fighting a war. So England looks at this and says, you know what? This situation's been going on for a long time, and it's just out of control. I mean, it's one thing to have smuggling, but it's another to have trading with the enemy. I mean, that gets close to treason. That's a serious matter. So England decides we've got to do something about enforcing the navigation laws, the Molasses Act, which are now decades old, but we're going to have to start enforcing it. We're going to have to get serious. So they established what was called the Board of Customs Commissioners. And I'll get that written down for you in some notes that you can check. The Board of Customs Commissioners. It's a government agency. It's an agency of the royal government that's designed to enforce the Molasses Act and other navigation laws in America. And its headquarters were in Boston. Those were the headquarters where the Boston Massacre took place. That's where the tax collecting agency is headquartered. It's in a building in Boston that's still there, the old State House. And the commissioners then are being paid by the royal treasury. So the assemblies have no control over them. This is a royal agency which we've never had in America. The Board of Trade was always located in London. Now this agency is located in Boston. And the point is to put it on the scene so that it can actively enforce the laws in a way that had never been done before. This is a separate law enforcement agency, if you will, just for the North Americans, just to collect the taxes and the navigation acts. The Board of Customs Commissioners was given the power to go out and search for evidence of criminal activity in the way that British law enforcement had always been able to do. A standard way to do that was what was called a search warrant, and we still use those today. The search warrants that we have today, which are a vital tool for law enforcement, go back centuries to the British precedents. Some of you may know about search warrants. They're issued by a judge. They stipulate exactly where law enforcement can search. They stipulate exactly what they can search for, and they are for a specified period of time. Law enforcement has 2 weeks or whatever it is, whatever the judge says, that's how long they can go out and search. But they can only search under very limited conditions specified in the warrant. The warrant says what they can search for and so forth. If they find something else, they can't use it in court. It's only what is identified in the warrant. And there is a concept, I didn't use this term exactly, but there's a concept there has to be some sort of probable cause. Law enforcement can't just go searching. They have to have some reason to search. They go to a judge, they tell the judge, we need to search this place. The judge says, okay, I'll give you a warrant, you can go search. That's the way it works. That's the way it had always worked in England. But there's also something in England that's very rarely used. It's not a basic part of English law. It's called a writ of assistance. A writ of assistance allows law enforcement to look anywhere, anytime, for anything. Well, law enforcement in England doesn't get writs of assistance. I'm not even sure what they were using. It's a rare thing. It's not a common or standard part of English common law. But it was granted to the agents working for the Board of Customs Commissioners. They could obtain a writ of assistance that would enable them to go search the home, the offices, the warehouses, the ships of a person they accuse, they think is engaging in smuggling. And writs of assistance are issued by the king, not by a local judge. Judges are all, local judges who are there because they're appointed, and they're usually appointed because the assembly has chosen them to be a judge. Now it's going to be outside of all local control. So these writs of assistance are going to enable the people to start searching and find evidence of criminal violation of the Navigation Acts. And then, in England and in America and everywhere in the British Empire forever, the standard tradition of when you're accused of a crime, you go to what is called a common law court. It's called common law because it's the standard law. It's the standard way to do things. And you go there, and the key thing, as you know, is a trial by jury. And you may also know, as part of the British tradition, these are the rights that Americans have as British subjects that they've always had and that they're proud of having, and they think they're so great because they have them, is the idea that you're innocent until proven guilty. The burden of proof is on the prosecution. You go to court, you're innocent until proven guilty, and the decision as to whether you're guilty or not is made by a jury. And that's the way it's worked in England for hundreds of years, and that's, as British subjects, that's what we Americans have done from the get-go. But now, English law is going to be changed only for North America, only for violations of Navigation Acts, that you can take a case to what is called an admiralty court. Admiralty courts are special courts that are sort of run by the Navy. The judge is appointed by the king, not by local officials, and as often as a naval officer. And typically they're designed to enforce, laws of against involving merchants or seamen, sailors. That's why they're called admiralty courts, because they don't deal with normal activity in England. They deal only with the merchants and the crews and so forth. But a key thing is that in an admiralty court, it's guilty until proven innocent. The burden of proof is on the defendant to prove that he or she did not commit the crime. And, as you might have anticipated, there are no juries. So, England, in order to enforce the Navigation Acts, in order to deal with what was a real problem, this business of smuggling was just out of control, and especially in wartime when they saw that even in wartime Americans didn't respect the law. So we've got a real problem with lawlessness in America, at least as far as the importing sugar from the foreign West Indies. And to deal with that, England has taken some emergency steps, and they've shut off some of the basic principles of American freedom. The freedom that we have, the liberty that we have as British subjects. Something that we've taken for granted as something that we've always had, something that makes the British subjects better than everybody else. Where we have all of these rights that nobody else has, and there are rights. There are rights as British subjects. But England is trying to take them away because of this special case of the smuggling. Now, there weren't actually that many cases brought. The other thing that they did, and that made it very hard to actually implement these new enforcement rules, was that the Admiralty Court that was going to be set up especially to hear these cases was located in, of all places, I love to do this in class when I can have students try to guess, because nobody ever guesses, because it's the place where the Admiralty Court was going to meet was Halifax, Nova Scotia. That's not even in the 13 traditional British colonies. It's in what is now Canada. So the government's going to be able to come into your warehouse or your ship or whatever, search for products, don't need a warrant, they can just search anytime they want. Then they're going to accuse you of smuggling. They're going to haul you all the way up to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and try you before an Admiralty Court, where you're going to have to prove that you're innocent, and you don't have a trial by jury. So that's a very serious thing. And that, although there's no riots, and in fact, the British didn't bring many cases against Americans. There weren't many times where they tried to arrest people and tried to convict them. So it wasn't that serious a problem because it didn't actually happen that often. But it's on the books. And it indicates this is what England is up to. What they are trying to do. They maybe not doing it so much, so there's no rioting or any protests against it in the same way that they've been rioting against the Stamp Act. But it's the idea that Britain is embarked on a new way of running their empire, and it's not the way it had always been. We're being deprived of the rights that we've been taking for granted for decades, for long periods of time. So, all right, after 1770, there's no rioting, there's no problems, there's no taxes being collected, and so there's a calm. But remember, there's all these other things going on in the background. There's this whole question of land in the West, and the Sugar Act is still on the books, but it's not very big, so it's not a problem. Parliament's still insisting that they can tax, and we say they can't, but they are. But they aren't collecting the money, so it doesn't matter. And then you've got this whole thing with the Admiralty Courts and the writs of assistance. So yeah, as of 1770, it's a calm. And it might have lasted for a long time. Nobody knows how long it would have lasted, because it's not exactly right, but there's nothing seriously disturbing it. But in 1773, something else came along, totally out of the blue. Something that had nothing to do with anything that we've been talking about. We've been talking about the taxes and Indians and land in the West and the smuggling, all that stuff. And then suddenly in 1773, something comes up that has nothing to do with anything we've talked about before, and it's going to disturb whatever peace they're had. So we'll talk about that in just a minute.